Have you ever poured your heart and soul into something, a memory, a promise, only to have someone try and bulldoze right over it with their petty rules and inflated ego? They told me my little fishing boat, the Martha, and a vessel more precious to me than any yacht, was suddenly an eyesore. They tried to block my access to the lake, the very water that held the last echoes of my wife's laughter. Well, let me tell you, they had absolutely no idea who they were messing with. My name is Arthur Finch, and this is the story of how a quiet, grieving widower, armed with nothing but old maps and a deep-seated respect for the law, took on the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association and shut down their entire fishing season. Ever had an HOA try to pull a fast one on you? Or maybe you've dealt with someone who just couldn't see past their own reflection. I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Where are you watching from today? Because this kind of arrogance, it seems, is a universal language. The little cottage on Hemlock Lane wasn't grand, not like the sprawling new constructions that had begun to the shoreline of Whisperwind Lake. Mine was old, settled, much like myself. My wife, Martha, had adored it. She'd loved the small, private dock at the end of our sloping yard, the one that offered direct access to the water. It wasn't a beach, just a sturdy wooden platform, barely wide enough for 2 chairs and the mooring cleats for the Martha and our 20-year-old Lund fishing boat. After Martha passed, the boat, the dock, the shimmering expanse of the lake, they became my sanctuary, my connection to her. I wasn't much of a fisherman, not really, but Martha had been. She'd spend hours out there, her line trailing in the water, a contented smile on her face. Now, I mostly just took the boat out to the middle of the lake, cut the engine, and listened. Listened for her. My routine was simple. Coffee on the porch, a walk through the woods behind the house, an hour or 2 tinkering with the Martha and's temperamental outboard, and then, if the weather was kind, a slow putter out onto the water. I was a retired maritime lawyer, with a peculiar side passion for historical cartography. My days of poring over admiralty charts and litigating salvage rights were long behind me, or so I thought. Now, my focus was on the subtle shifts in the wind, the way the light played on the water, the quiet company of memories. The Lakeview Estates, HOA, a relatively new entity born from the influx of city money and weekend warriors, had mostly left me alone. My property predated their grand designs by several decades, and my access to the lake was, I firmly believed, an unshakable, deeded right. Then came Reginald Thorne. Thorne was the newly elected president of the HOA, a man whose ambition seemed to be matched only by the shine on his imported Italian loafers. He drove a car that cost more than my cottage and spoke with an air of condescending authority that set my teeth on edge from our first, brief encounter at the local post office. He was all veneers and pronouncements, a man who clearly believed the world, or at least Whisperwind Lake, revolved around his impeccably tailored self. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, crisp and official-looking, bearing the ostentatious gold-embossed logo of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. It was polite in that chillingly impersonal way that precedes a bureaucratic bludgeoning. It cited newly ratified Community Aesthetic and Environmental Harmony Bylaws, Article 7, Section B, Subsection 3, Prohibition of undesirable watercraft and unapproved docking structures. My aging and unsightly fishing vessel, the letter stated, was in violation. Furthermore, my rudimentary docking facility did not meet the newly established community standards for shoreline presentation. I was given 30 days to remove the Martha and then dismantle the dock, or face daily fines and potential legal action to reclaim community shoreline for beautification purposes. I read it 3 times. Undesirable watercraft, aging and unsightly. The Martha and was meticulously maintained. She wasn't fiberglass and chrome, true, but she was sound, clean, and full of character. And Martha had loved that boat. The dock, built by Martha's father, was equally sturdy, weathered silver by years of sun and rain, a testament to honest craftsmanship. Reclaim community shoreline? This was my shoreline, my deeded access. A cold fury, something I hadn't felt in years, began to smolder deep within me, pushing aside the persistent fog of grief for a moment. This wasn't just an attack on my property. It was an attack on Martha's memory. It was an affront to everything quiet and decent. My initial response was a wave of disbelief, quickly followed by a surge of anger, so profound it almost made me dizzy. How dare they? I slumped into Martha's old armchair, the letter crinkling in my trembling hand. The nerve of Thorne, a man who probably thought a sextant was a type of insect, dictating what I could and couldn't do on property that had been in Martha's family for generations before Lakeview Estates, was even a gleam in some developer's avaricious eye. For a moment, I considered just ignoring it. What could they really do? But the mention of legal action and daily fines gave me pause. Thorne struck me as the type to pursue such matters with vindictive glee. Then, a different thought began to form, a spark of something that had lain dormant for too long. They don't know who I am. They saw an old man, quiet, perhaps a little lost in his grief. They didn't see the decades spent navigating the labyrinthine complexities of maritime law, the nights spent poring over ancient charts and deeds to establish rights of way through contested waters. They didn't know that my mind, though perhaps slower to recall grocery lists these days, was still a steel trap for legal precedent and cartographic detail. A decision crystallized. I would not be bullied. I would not let them erase Martha's sanctuary. I would fight, not with shouting or angry letters, but with the tools I knew best: research, precision, and an unyielding adherence to the letter of the law. All right, Mr. Thorne, I thought, a grim smile touching my lips, you want to talk about rights and access? Let's talk. The cobwebs in my study weren't just on the bookshelves. They were on parts of me I thought were long dormant. I pulled down dusty tomes on property law, riparian rights, easement disputes. My old brass, parallel rulers, and dividers emerged from a forgotten drawer. The large wooden map case, a relic from my days in practice, creaked open to reveal rolled charts and surveys, some dating back to the earliest days of settlement in this county. The familiar scent of old paper and ink was invigorating. My first port of call, however, was the county records office. It was a dim, hushed place, smelling faintly of decaying paper and floor wax. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, looked at me with mild disinterest when I requested access to the original plat maps for the entire Whisperwind Lake area, along with all associated deeds and easements pertaining to Hemlock Lane and the surrounding parcels now encompassed by Lakeview Estates. "That's a lot of documents, sir," she said, her voice flat. "I have time," I replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. Hours turned into days. A meticulously unrolled fragile, crackling maps, some hand-drawn on linen, their boundaries marked with faded ink. I cross-referenced deed numbers, traced property lines back through generations of owners, noted every mention of water rights, access clauses, and restrictive covenants. It was like piecing together a giant, historical jigsaw puzzle. The initial search confirmed what I already knew. My property, inherited by Martha from her grandfather, included explicit, deeded access to Whisperwind Lake, an easement that predated the formation of Lakeview Estates by nearly a century. This was a good start, but Thorne and his HOA were likely relying on some newer, broader interpretation of community control, probably through the master deed of the development itself. I needed to understand their claim as well as my own. During one of my breaks, nursing a lukewarm coffee in the records office canteen, I overheard a snippet of conversation from a nearby table. Two county surveyors were discussing the upcoming Lakeview Estates annual fishing tournament, a major event for the HOA, apparently Thorne's personal pet project and a significant source of his local clout. One mentioned something about Thorne pushing for exclusive use of the Northern Cove for the tournament weigh-in and festivities. Interesting, I thought. The Northern Cove was traditionally considered public access, though rarely used by anyone but a few old-timers. My preliminary investigation had given me a foundation, but I knew I needed more than just my own ancient deed. I needed to understand the lay of the land, both legally and socially. That led me to Jedediah Hemlock, or Old Man Hemlock, as he was known locally. He lived in a cabin even more secluded than mine, a veritable fixture of the lake, his memory stretching back further than most written records. He was rumored to have worked on some of an original land surveys in his youth. I found Hemlock on his porch, mending a fishing net, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and wind. He looked up as I approached, his eyes, though faded, sharp and appraising. "Arthur Finch," I said, extending a hand. "My wife Martha and I bought the old Miller place on Hemlock Lane some years back." He grunted, his handshake surprisingly firm. Knew Miller. Knew his father. "What brings a man like you, who looks like he'd rather be reading a book, to my neck of the woods?" I explained the letter from the HOA, Thorne's demands. Hemlock spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Thorne, fancies himself king of the lake, that one. Thinks a fancy title and a rulebook thicker than a city phone directory gives him dominion over God's green earth and blue water." He squinted at me. "Your wife, Martha, she loved that little boat, didn't she? Good woman." "Shame. She did," I said, a lump forming in my throat. "That's why this matters so much." "So what are you going to do, Finch? Roll over?" "No," I said firmly. "I intend to fight. Legally. I was a maritime lawyer." A flicker of interest in Hemlock's eyes. "Maritime, eh? Bet you've seen a few sharks in your day." "Thorne's just a piranha. Thinks he's a great white," he paused. "Got some old maps myself. Things the county might have misplaced. Showing original public easements, access points the developers tried to bury when they started carving up the shoreline for their McMansions." My heart gave a little leap. "Could I see them, Mr. Hemlock? Jedediah. Or Hemlock. And maybe, if you ain't afraid of a little dust and a lot of truth." Hemlock became an invaluable, if cantankerous, ally. His hand-drawn annotations on ancient survey maps, his recollections of boundary disputes long settled or conveniently forgotten, provided context and avenues of inquiry I wouldn't have found in official records alone. He also pointed me towards Sarah Jenkins. "Young woman, down on Willow Creek Drive," Hemlock had said. "Thorne's HOA fined her near $500 for unapproved garden statuary gnomes. Can you believe it? Threatened to put a lien on her house. She might be looking for a bit of spine to borrow." I found Sarah Jenkins weeding her small, impeccably kept garden, a collection of cheerful, if undeniably kitschy, gnomes peeking out from behind rose bushes. She was younger, perhaps in her late 30s, with a weary frustration in her eyes. "Mr. Finch?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans when I introduced myself. "Jedediah Hemlock said you might call." I explained my situation, and she listened intently, nodding. "It's Thorne," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He gets a little power, and he thinks he owns everyone. Those gnomes, my kids love them. He called them a blight on the community's aesthetic integrity. I paid the fine. I was scared. My husband travels for work, and I didn't want trouble." "Understand," I said. "But sometimes, not wanting trouble just invites more of it from people like Thorne. I'm looking into the legality of some of the HOA's claims, specifically regarding lake access. Your issue is different, but it speaks to a pattern." "Pattern of bullying, you mean?" Sarah said, a spark igniting in her eyes. "If there's anything I can do, I'm good with research, online stuff. And I know a lot of people in the estates who are fed up with Thorne's petty tyranny, but are too afraid to speak out." And so, our small band of rebels began to form. A grieving widower with a lawyer's mind, a curmudgeonly old-timer with a memory like a steel trap, and a young mother with a knack for digital digging and a network of discontented neighbors. The next few weeks were a blur of intense activity. Hemlock's old maps, cross-referenced with official county surveys and my own meticulous charting, began to reveal fascinating discrepancies. Sarah, meanwhile, delved into the HOA's incorporation documents, its bylaws, and the minutes of past meetings, often working late into the night after her children were asleep. She discovered a clause in the original Lakeview Estate's master deed that referenced pre-existing public rights-of-way along certain sections of the shoreline, rights that the HOA seemed to have conveniently ignored or attempted to obfuscate with newer, more restrictive community rules. The real bombshell, however, lay hidden in the archives of the State Department of Natural Resources, a place few would think to look for HOA disputes. Following a hunch prompted by one of Hemlock's rambling anecdotes about the old fish hatchery that used to operate on the north side of the lake. I requested records pertaining to state-owned or leased lands around Whisperwind Lake. After days of sifting through dusty files, I found it, a forgotten but still legally binding 50-year lease agreement dating back to the 1970s. The state had leased a significant tract of shoreline, including the entirety of the Northern Cove and its access points, to the county for public recreational use, specifically including fishing and boating access. The lease had an automatic renewal clause unless formally terminated by either party with 5 years' notice. There was no record of such termination. The county, it seemed, had largely forgotten about this specific parcel, and the HOA, under Thorne's ambitious expansion of control, had simply started treating it as their de facto private domain. The very area Thorne planned for his exclusive fishing tournament weigh-in and festivities was, in fact, state land mandated for public use. My heart pounded. This was it. This was the leverage we needed. Meanwhile, Thorne, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, was escalating his campaign against me. I received another letter, this one more threatening, informing me that daily fines of $100 were now accruing for my non-compliance. Then, one Saturday morning, as I was oiling the Martha Ann's outboard, Thorne himself appeared on my dock, flanked by 2 other stern-faced HOA board members. "Mr. Finch," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't bother with a greeting. "We've been very patient. Your boat is still here. Your dock is still an eyesore. This is your final and formal warning. The next step will be a formal legal complaint and a lien on your property." He gestured dismissively at the Martha, and, frankly, it's an embarrassment to the community. We're trying to build something upscale here, something exclusive. I straightened up slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. I looked him directly in the eye. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice calm and even, "I am perfectly within my rights. This boat and this dock are on my property, with deeded access that predates your entire association. As for community standards, perhaps you should be more concerned with adhering to actual legal statutes and public rights before you go around bullying residents." Thorne's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. "Are you threatening me, old man?" "Not at all," I replied, a slight smile playing on my lips. "I merely state facts. I would advise you to consult with a competent attorney regarding the true extent of the HOA's authority, particularly concerning pre-existing easements and public access rights around this lake. You might be surprised by what you learn." His eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this, Finch. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I think I do," I thought. "And you, Mr. Thorne, have no idea who you've just provoked." His overconfidence was palpable. He saw my quiet demeanor as weakness, my age as irrelevance. He couldn't imagine that the old man with the unsightly boat was meticulously dismantling his little empire from the inside out. With the discovery of the state lease agreement, our strategy began to solidify. It wasn't just about defending my access anymore. It was about exposing Thorne's overreach and the HOA's disregard for public rights on a much larger scale. The annual Lakeview Estates fishing tournament, Thorne's pride and joy, became our designated target. It was public, it was a signature event, and, crucially, its planned location was now demonstrably problematic. Sarah, Hemlock, and I gathered in my small living room, maps spread across the floor, legal documents piled on the coffee table. "So, the Northern Cove, where they hold the weigh-in, the big barbecue, the prize ceremony, it's all on state-leased public land?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "Precisely," I confirmed, tapping the relevant clause in the lease document. "The HOA has no authority to restrict access there, nor can they claim it for exclusive use for their tournament." Hemlock cackled. "Thorne's going to have a conniption fit. Serves him right. Always hated that tournament. Bunch of city slickers in fancy bass boats, scaring all the real fish away. The plan, I outlined, is not to be aggressive, but to be unimpeachably correct. I will draft formal letters, with copies of all supporting documentation, the state lease, the original plat maps showing public easements, relevant sections of property law, to several entities. I ticked them off on my fingers. First, to Mr. Thorne and the HOA board. formally notifying them of their encroachment on public lands and the illegality of restricting access for their tournament. Second, to the county commissioners, alerting them to the HOA's misuse of county-managed, state-leased public recreational land. Third, to the State Department of Natural Resources, informing them of the situation and requesting clarification of their stance on the lease and public access. And finally, I pause for effect. I will file for a temporary injunction with the county court to prevent the HOA from illegally restricting public access to the Northern Cove during their tournament. Sarah's smile was dazzling. Arthur, this is brilliant. It's not just about your boat anymore. This could force the HOA to respect everyone's rights. That's the idea, I said. Thorn uses rules and regulations as a weapon. We'll use the actual law as a shield and perhaps a well-aimed spear. While I meticulously drafted the legal notices and court filings, Thorn, completely oblivious, was ramping up promotion for the fishing tournament. Flyers appeared in local shops, boasting of record prize money and exclusive access to Whisperwind Lake's premier fishing hotspots. He even gave an interview to the local weekly paper, puffing his chest about the community spirit and the upscale recreational opportunities provided by Lakeview Estates under his visionary leadership. Sarah brought me the clipping, and we both had a grim chuckle. His arrogance was actively helping build our case. The stakes, however, were also rising. A few days after my confrontation with Thorn on the dock, I received a notice from the County Code Enforcement Office. An anonymous complaint had been filed regarding unsafe wiring in a dilapidated woodshed on my property. It was clearly retaliation, a transparent attempt by Thorn to harass me through other channels. The wiring was perfectly sound, recently inspected, and the woodshed, while old, was structurally fine. Dealing with the inspector, though he was ultimately reasonable, was an added stress, a clear sign that Thorn was willing to play dirty. "He's trying to wear you down, Arthur," Sarah said, her voice laced with concern when I told her. "He's underestimating my stamina," I replied, though a sliver of anxiety did pierce my resolve. This was no longer just a battle of wits and documents. Thorn was making it personal. I remembered Martha, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in doing what was right. That memory firmed my spine. He will not win. The week before the tournament was a whirlwind of activity. I hand-delivered my carefully prepared packages of documents to the HOA office, where a flustered secretary accepted the thick envelope for Thorn with trembling hands. To the county commissioner's building, ensuring it was date-stamped and logged. To the regional DNR office, where I had a surprisingly productive conversation with a senior ranger who seemed genuinely interested in the forgotten lease agreement. And finally, to the county courthouse, where I filed the application for the temporary injunction, requesting an expedited hearing if possible, or at least a formal advisory to the HOA regarding potential violations if they proceeded with restricting access. The response from Thorn was initially silence, a deep, ominous silence that I suspected was him scrambling to consult the HOA's undoubtedly expensive and likely now very concerned legal counsel. The county and state offices sent polite acknowledgments of receipt, promising to review the materials. Then, 2 days before the tournament, Thorn cracked. He called me. His voice, usually so smooth and self-assured, was strained, laced with barely suppressed fury. "Finch, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You're trying to sabotage the biggest community event of the year. This tournament is for the good of Lakeview Estates." "Mr. Thorn," I replied calmly, "I am merely trying to ensure that all activities around Whisperwind Lake are conducted legally and with respect for public rights. Your tournament, as currently planned, appears to infringe upon state-leased public recreational land. I have provided you, the county, and the state with all the relevant documentation. This is an outrage, an attack. Our lawyers will bury you in paperwork. Old man, your lawyers are welcome to review the public record, as I have," I said. "Perhaps they can advise you on the best way to proceed without breaking state and county regulations. I simply want to launch my boat, Mr. Thorn, from my own dock, and perhaps enjoy a day's fishing in the Northern Cove, as is my right, and the right of any member of the public. There was a sputtering sound on the other end, then the line went dead. I smiled. The first crack in a dam. The morning of the Lakeview Estates annual fishing tournament dawned bright and clear, a perfect early summer day. The Northern Cove, usually a quiet spot, was already buzzing with activity when I arrived, not in the Martha but in my old pickup truck, a large portfolio case resting on the passenger seat. Pickup trucks were definitely not Thorne's preferred aesthetic. Banners proclaiming Lakeview Estates Fishing Classic flapped in the gentle breeze. A large marquee had been erected for the weigh-in station and the planned barbecue. Dozens of expensive, gleaming base boats were being launched from a temporary ramp that had been graded onto the shoreline, the very shoreline that was part of the state-leased public land. Reginald Thorne himself was strutting about, dressed in a gaudy fishing vest adorned with far too many patches, a microphone in hand, already addressing the assembling crowd of contestants and onlookers. "Welcome, welcome to the premier fishing event on Whisperwind Lake," he boomed, his voice amplified by a portable speaker system. "Thanks to the vision of your HOA, we have secured this prime location for our exclusive use today." I chose that moment to make my approach. With me were two individuals I had requested accompany me: a county sheriff's deputy, a young professional officer named Miller, whom I briefed on the potential for a civil dispute over access, and Ms. Evans, a quietly authoritative representative from the State Department of Natural Resources, who had driven up that morning after reviewing my documents and conferring with her superiors. They were there as neutral observers to ensure peace and clarify official positions if needed. As I walked towards Thorne, the portfolio under my arm, a murmur went through the crowd. Thorne spotted me, and his face, already ruddy from the sun, or perhaps his own self-importance, darkened. "Finch," he snarled, lowering the microphone. "What do you want? You're not registered for this tournament. This is private HOA property today." "Actually, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice clear and carrying surprisingly well in the sudden hush, "that's not entirely accurate." I opened my portfolio and drew out a large, laminated copy of the original state lease agreement, alongside a highlighted survey map. This area, the Northern Cove, including this launch ramp and the land where your marquee stands, is, according to these official state and county records, part of a parcel leased by the state of Wisconsin to the county for public recreational use. That lease is still active. Thorne stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. "This is absurd. Preposterous. Our HOA has maintained this area for years." "Maintaining an area doesn't grant ownership or the right to exclude the public, Mr. Thorne," Ms. Evans from the DNR interjected, stepping forward. Her voice was calm but firm. "We've reviewed Mr. Finch's documentation, and it appears to be correct. This land is designated for public access. Your association cannot legally restrict public entry or declare it for your exclusive use without express permission from both the county and the state, permission which, I can assure you, has not been granted for this event." The color drained from Thorne's face. He looked wildly from me to Deputy Miller, to Ms. Evans, then to the stunned faces of the HOA members and tournament participants. But the tournament, the prizes, the sponsors," he stammered, his bravado crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. "You can still hold a tournament, Mr. Thorne," I said mildly. "You just can't prevent other members of the public from using this area. For example," I gestured towards the lake, "I believe I'll take my boat out for a little fishing in the cove this morning. And perhaps some of these other folks, who aren't part of your exclusive event, might like to do the same." A wave of confused, then angry, murmurs swept through the crowd. Some were HOA members who had paid hefty entry fees for what they believed was an exclusive event. Others were local residents, not part of the HOA, who had often felt shut out by Thorne's increasingly proprietary attitude towards the lake. Thorne sputtered, "This is you can't. I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone." Deputy Miller stepped forward slightly. "Sir, I'd advise you to remain calm. Right now, this is a civil matter regarding access to public land. Mr. Finch and any other member of the public have the right to be here. If you attempt to forcibly remove anyone or block their access, that could become a different issue. The fight visibly drained out of Thorne. His shoulders slumped. The microphone dangled uselessly from his hand. His exclusive event had just been publicly and comprehensively de-exclusivized. The carefully constructed facade of his authority had shattered. The magnificent Lakeview Estates fishing classic descended into chaos. Anglers who had paid for exclusive access were now faced with the prospect of sharing their prime fishing spots with any member of the public who cared to launch a boat. Some demanded refunds from a now ashen-faced Thorne. Others just packed up their expensive gear and left in disgust, muttering about mismanagement and false advertising. The DNR representative, Ms. Evans, calmly explained to inquiring residents that yes, this area had always been intended for public use, and the state would be reminding the county of its obligations under the lease. A local newspaper reporter, tipped off by Sarah Jenkins, who had coincidentally decided to take a morning stroll by the cove with her camera, was having a field day, scribbling notes furiously and snapping pictures of the bewildered contestants and Thorne's crestfallen visage. Thorne himself seemed to shrink before my eyes. His bluster was gone, replaced by a pasty, defeated look. He made a few desperate calls on his cell phone, presumably to the HOA's lawyers, but it was clear the damage was done. His grand tournament, the symbol of his power and prestige, was a shambles. His authority, built on a foundation of arrogance and misrepresentation, had been publicly dismantled by an old man with a handful of dusty documents. The immediate consequences for Thorne were swift and brutal. Within hours, the Lakeview Estates online forum, which Sarah monitored, was alight with angry posts from members demanding Thorne's resignation. Sponsors, embarrassed by the debacle, began to withdraw their support. The threat of lawsuits from disgruntled tournament participants who felt defrauded became very real. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. As for me, I didn't stay to witness Thorne's complete meltdown. Once it was clear that public access to the cove would be respected, I thanked Deputy Miller and Ms. Evans. Then I drove home, hitched the Martha into my truck, and returned to the northern cove. I launched her easily from the now uncontested public ramp. The motor coughed to life, and I steered her out into the sparkling water, right past the remnants of Thorne's disastrous event. There were no fines, no barriers, no condescending pronouncements. Just the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the open expanse of the lake. It was more than just a boat ride. It was a reclamation. My small, personal injustice had been rectified, but in the process, something much larger had been achieved. The lake felt a little more open, a little more free for everyone. The following weeks saw a seismic shift in the power dynamics of Lakeview Estates. Reginald Thorne, facing overwhelming pressure and the prospect of multiple legal challenges, resigned as HOA president in disgrace. The story of his public humiliation at the fishing tournament became local legend. The HOA, under new, more chastened leadership, was forced to conduct a thorough review of all its rules and land claims, particularly concerning shoreline access and public rights of way. Several of Thorne's more egregious aesthetic rules were quietly rescinded. Sarah Jenkins joyfully reported that her garden gnomes were now officially tolerated, even admired by some of her neighbors who felt newly emboldened to express their own individuality. My own Doc and the Martha and were, of course, left in peace. The new HOA board sent me a remarkably polite letter confirming my deeded access and apologizing for the previous misunderstanding. I didn't rub it in. Justice, when achieved through diligence and fact, needed no further embellishment. The experience, however, had changed me. The fight had shaken off some of the lingering lethargy of grief, replacing it with a renewed sense of purpose. I started a small, informal Know Your Rights coffee morning once a month at the local library, helping other residents understand property laws, easement issues, and how to navigate disputes with bureaucratic entities. Old Man Hemlock often joined, providing colorful historical context. Even Sarah attended, sharing her research skills. Sometimes I still just took the Martha and out to the middle of the lake and listened for my Martha. But now, the silence felt different. It was still filled with her memory, but it was also overlaid with a quiet satisfaction. I had honored her, not just by keeping her boat, but by protecting the peace and fairness she had cherished. Thorn and his ilk believed power came from pronouncements and expensive toys. I had rediscovered that true strength often lies in quiet knowledge, meticulous preparation, and the unwavering conviction that some things, like a memory, a promise, or the simple right to access a beloved lake, are worth fighting for. It just goes to show, doesn't it? Never underestimate the quiet ones. And always, always read the fine print, especially when it's written on an old, forgotten map. Justice can be a slow current, but with persistence, it eventually reaches the sea. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to stand up for your own patch of ground, I hope you'll share your thoughts. It's important to remember that one person, armed with the truth, can indeed make a difference.